It is an honor, and I am so grateful to be here with you to share my big idea. But first, a little background. I have a personal passion for getting to know people. And I think part of this passion comes from growing up in a really small rural community. I grew up in a town of about 200 people. And how we got there was my dad had grown up in the city, and he'd always wanted to live out in the country. And where we ended up wasn't in the suburbs with a big yard kind of country. It was more like Little House on the Prairie kind of country. So let me show you a picture of where we ended up. This is Yorkville, Indiana, and we lived right there is our house. And this is about a 2-mile stretch, and as you can see, it's basically just us and the woods. There was no school, there were no street lights, there was no post office, and we lived on top of a really steep, tall hill. Now, as a kid, I just thought it was normal that you could put a sled out at your front door in the winter and slide for well over a quarter mile from your front door without stopping. That just seemed like the normal thing. But what that meant is that in going in the opposite direction, it was really hard to get to our house, particularly in the winter. And one year we went from January to March without ever being able to reach that little access road that you can see kind of winds up there. And we spent 3 months with hiking as the only way to get to our house. But what also made us very remote is that we did not have city water or a well. And our only source of water was a truck that would deliver it once every 2 weeks. And in the wintertime, the truck would refuse to deliver if there was even a snowflake on this long drive. And so we would often go for long periods of time without water, and even when the truck did deliver it, the water would often freeze. Knowing people in our small community was essential. From Old Red, who would take time away from tending his prize horses to help us shovel this long driveway so we could get water, to Anna Jo, the town matriarch, who would have us over for a warm meal, showers, and send us home with chains to put on our tires so we could make it home, to Betty, who had and still has the best sense of humor to make any situation, even when you couldn't get to your house and you had no water when you got there, seem like just something to laugh at and nothing more. Knowing people was essential. Now, I'm not just talking about knowing about people. I can know about my neighbor, and they're not going to help me shovel for 6 hours to shovel my driveway. This is about connection. And so that's really what I'm talking about today, is about connecting with others, because in everything we do here, whether we're trying to influence change, whether we're trying to hold people accountable, or whether we're trying to coordinate our own change plans, connection is essential. But what's so interesting to me is that while it is so essential for our results, most of us don't have an intentional way for connecting with others, or we don't explore how we could be better at it. And missed opportunities for connection pass us by almost every hour. Well, when I was in middle school, we moved to Boca Raton, Florida. And it was a bit of culture shock. So I quickly learned that you could be ostracized for wearing Smurf tennis shoes. There was such a thing called pizza delivery. And this blew my mind because you could essentially go out to eat for dinner and never leave your home. And even though there were more people, there was much less connection. And I was so struck at how we could live in a town that was so isolated and feel so connected, and move to a place that had so many people and feel so isolated. And I learned then that you've got to cultivate connection. Just because of where I stand or whatever label I have, whatever my faith is or my ethnicity or my religion or where I sit at work and what team I'm on, it doesn't mean we're connecting. You really have to cultivate it. And so today I'm going to share with you 2 key elements to connection. And they're somewhat common sense. They're somewhat ordinary. But I am so excited to share with you how 2 very ordinary things can be the access point for something extraordinary. So the first element that I'd like to share with you is curiosity. Now, I am an intensely curious person, and so I'm very struck sometimes by the lack of curiosity people have for one another. So I'm single, and I was on a date the other night, and this gentleman was very nice, who's from New York, and I was asking him lots of questions. So I asked him about his family. It turns out a major motion picture had been filmed in his family's home. I asked him about sports. Turns out he was a former professional baseball player. And by the end of the dinner, I realized this man had not asked me a single question. And as we're leaving the restaurant, we're walking to the metro, we're about to say goodbye. And as we're walking, it's like it dawns on him at the very end of the date that he knows nothing about me. And he turns to me with his New York accent and he says, "So, you got a favorite color or something?" And I said, "Green and good night." So often we can spend time with people and not really connect with them. We can be with our family, but we're texting, we're not connecting with them. And it just takes small acts of curiosity to make a big impact. Bigger than asking your favorite color, by the way. But small acts of curiosity to make a big impact. And also, small acts of curiosity can have really interesting side effects. So outside of Vital Smarts, I also teach negotiation. Now, negotiation is a lot like crucial conversations. You want A, I want B, let's work it out. So in the body of research and negotiation, one thing they find is that connection and curiosity for another leads to better results in a negotiation. And I want to share with you a certain nuance in that body of research. And it has to do with how inquiry can have a really interesting side effect. So they've studied the impact of emotions on negotiations, and they find that if you have a negative emotion, like anger, sadness, or disgust, that negatively impacts your negotiation, even if those emotions have nothing to do with the negotiation. They call this the emotional hangover. A researcher called Jennifer Lerner from Harvard coined that term, that the emotion hangs over into the negotiation and you're less adept at analyzing your interests, you make more errors, and those errors directly translate into lost dollars at the negotiation table. Well, they wanted to figure out what is a simple way to diffuse the impact of that emotional hangover. So the University of Virginia and the University of Michigan crafted a very clever study. What they did is they called people and they surveyed them and they said, "Tell us your life satisfaction, rate your life satisfaction." Half the people they called on a sunny day and half the people they called on a rainy day. And what they found was the people that they called on a rainy day rated their life satisfaction lower. That somehow the weather caused them to rate their life satisfaction differently. Well, then they added one question when they called folks. And they said right at the beginning of the call, "How's the weather there?" And what they found was when the people in the rainy conditions named and acknowledged the bad weather, it diffused the impact. When those people said, "Oh yeah, it's really rainy here, it's really awful," that they then answered that question about life satisfaction as positively as the people in the sunny conditions. Acknowledging the bad weather diffused its impact, and inquiry helped make that happen. Now translate that into the workplace. What if you got to a meeting a couple minutes early and turned to that coworker next to you and just turned to them and said, "How are you?" That gives them a chance to say, "Oh, my commute was awful. Oh my gosh, I just came out of a meeting with the boss and I'm so frustrated," so that that emotion doesn't hang over into your meeting and into your next situation. Small acts of curiosity can have a big impact. But just asking questions doesn't mean I'm curious. I can ask a question that's manipulative, controlling, self-serving. And at best, those interactions are transactional. And we've all been there. I don't care about connecting with you. I just want to know when you're going to get this document to me. I don't care about connecting with you. I just want to know why you did that yesterday. At best, those are transactional. But if I ask questions with the intent to honor and value the other person, with the intent to connect, those interactions have the opportunity to be transformational. And so the question to ask yourself every day is, do I want more transactions or more transformations? So I want to give you an example of something that for me was quite transformational, and it leads me to the second point that I'd like to bring up, and that is you got to be present. You've got to be present and in the moment. So let me bring this to life a little bit. Last spring, I went on a family vacation with my mom, my dad, my sister, who is in the audience, and myself, just the four of us, to Ireland for my mom's birthday. And every night after touring Ireland, we would retire into someone's hotel room, and my sister would pull out this very special book called 300 Questions to Ask Your Parents Before It's Too Late. And we would just be in the moment with their touching and insightful and often hilarious answers. And the questions were simple. Some of them I didn't even think we should bother and ask because I felt like I knew the answer already. One was, what was your neighborhood like growing up? And I was like, I know that. I've been to your neighborhood every year since I was a baby. I know what it was like. But I didn't know what it was like when they were growing up. Another question was, what would you have changed about your wedding? Another one was, what's the most mischievous thing you did as a child? And another one was, what experience have you had that you still want your own children to experience? And my mom said this, she said, I want my kids to love a sports team so much that when they play, it gives them goosebumps. And when they lose, you lose sleep. And when they win, it is your own joy. There is no show we could have paid money to go see those nights, no comedian we could have gone to see, no video we could have rented that would have replicated the belly laughs, the touching moments, and the memories that I didn't even know were possible, that were even out there to exist. Inquiry and being present really makes a difference. And so, being with my parents was a really special moment. And being present, I just want to emphasize that point. Because being present, when we ask those questions, we weren't just asking those questions and sort of half texting while they were answering. We weren't asking those questions and practicing a river dance for the next night. We asked those questions and we listened with our whole bodies. We listened without all the mental noise. In the moments of my life where I have been the happiest, it is always connected to being in the moment and being present. And I can also say that in those moments where I have been anxious and when I have been worried, I can also say those are always connected to being out of the moment and not being present. We spend our time spinning our brains in the past and being anxious or worrying and being in the future, and we miss that only thing that's real. Everything else is in our head. We miss the only thing that's real, and that is this moment. And this is really hard for me. They say that you teach that what you most need to learn. This is it for me. Because, I could do it in Ireland, where we could put all our electronics away and sit and relax in a hotel room. But in the day-to-day, that is so hard. And it's hard for me because I am so driven by getting things done, and I'm so driven by goals. And so I tell myself, I can't be in the moment because I've got to get all these things done, and I've got to rehash this conversation in my head so I can figure it out, and I've got to clean this thing and multitask here. And I tell myself I do that so eventually I'll be ready for the moment. Eventually, I'll be ready for that moment. And what I'm horrified to discover is that happens at the expense of the moment. So I take yoga to help me with this. And yoga is basically a series of poses, they all have names, and you center yourself, you kind of empty your mind, and you end up feeling very relaxed and present and stretched and strong. Well, just want to give you a little insight into my yoga practice. So it starts out, we usually sit down, and we come up with an intention, and everyone picks their own intention, and I usually create something that's very lofty, like love all that I encounter, or inner peace. And then we start. And we usually start in a pose called downward dog. And I don't particularly like downward dog. And so immediately I'm like, why are we in downward dog? Why can't we be in pigeon? I want to be in pigeon. Is this teacher asleep? Who's this teacher? Is this a sub? Back to love, back to love, back to love, back to love. Oh my gosh, do I have on the see-through pants? Oh my gosh, I have the see-through pants on. Who's behind me? Candace, why do you always buy things on sale? Oh my gosh, why didn't you just pay more? Back to love, back to love, back to love. Okay, I'm really hungry. Okay, if I can get to the grocery store before it closes, then I can also go to the bank. And if I can go to the bank, then that means I can also run these 3 errands. And if I get home, wait, back to love, back to love. And I end the class more stressed than I was to begin with. And I think we can all relate to that on some level, that we go to interact with people and we're busy while we're talking to them. We're physically in front of them, and our minds are in the past or in the future and not in the moment. And again, we're unaware of the suffering, the distance, and the lack of results that we create ourselves. And we rush through life missing the most precious and only thing we have, which is this moment. And so I want to offer you a challenge. So I'd like you to get out a pen, and I want you to write down 2 names. The first name I'd like you to write down is someone you'd like to connect with more. Maybe it's a sibling or a parent or a coworker. The second name is someone you actively avoid or you need to have a crucial conversation with, or they're not your favorite person, but you need to still interact with them in order to get results. And I want you to write their name down. And my challenge is that before you leave here today, before you go to lunch, before you leave this room to go to lunch, I want you to think about, when in the next week could I interact with both of these people and be more curious and be more present? Maybe you want to ask them a different question. Maybe you want to be more intentional in your listening. And I have 3 tips for you for when you do this. The first is I want you to identify your crucial moment for when you get out of the moment. Perhaps it is a reaction to something they say, you get triggered. Perhaps it's like me, where it's on your way there, you get stuck in traffic and you're late. Or you before you go to open their office door, you check an email and your mind goes spinning. And what happens is I get home later that night and I'm like, oh, I forgot I was supposed to be present. Oh, I forgot. And you miss the opportunity completely. And in that crucial moment, one thing I've been doing is I've been thinking about a quote from someone named Eckhart Tolle. Has anyone heard of him? Yeah, he wrote The Power of Now and a New Earth. And I recommend, if you're interested in this topic, read those books. He's great. And his quote is, to love is to recognize yourself in another. Isn't that magnificent? To recognize yourself in another. And I find that is a great little grounding statement, whether I'm going to go meet with somebody I like or somebody I don't like. How can I recognize myself in that other person? The second tip is another crucial moment that I have is that when an opportunity for connection comes my way, I have some form of this statement in my head. It's some form of, I don't have time for this. And it's either, I'm sorry, I don't have time for this, or I don't have time for this. It's some form of that. And what I've been trying to do is reverse that statement to, I have time for this. I don't have time to not have time for this. And the irony is that often that which we're resisting, that what we're saying I don't have time for, is what we most need and want and desire. And an example I relate to is, I don't have time to connect with you. I'm too busy being lonely. The third tip I'd like to offer is something from an art class that came up. Many art classes in college campuses, they have an assignment, and that is, look at a painting and just stare at it for several hours. Just look at that painting. Pick one painting and stare at it for several hours, and then see what you notice. And what students typically report is that new beauty and nuance emerges, and they have a greater appreciation for that painting. What if you applied that same assignment to these 2 people and to your relationships? What if you just really looked at your spouse without all the mental noise and the judgment? What if you looked at that bully at work? Would new beauty and nuance emerge? Now, how does all this connect to training and connect to the workplace? Well, one of our colleagues, Steve Willis, tested this about being present in the classroom. And he did a really interesting study. What he did is he got to several classes in a row where he got to class early, and while participants were coming in, he was busy getting his flip charts ready, he was checking the wires on the projector, and when the time came to start class, he started class, having not greeted anybody that came in. Then he measured how many times did people raise their hand when he asked questions. Then he did a series of classes, and what he did is he had everything ready half an hour before the class started. And as the participants came in the door, he shook their hand, he looked them in the eye, he greeted them, he asked them their name, and he connected with them. And then he measured how much participation did he have when he asked questions. And what he found was that when he was present to people, there was significantly more participation. That being present can make a difference even in the classroom. We teach through our presence. We teach by being. Now, I can't take credit for that last phrase. That was also from Eckhart Tolle. And he defines being present as seeing and hearing without thought, seeing and hearing without judgment. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, he's telling us how to be a zombie. Like, that sounds like, I have no thoughts, let's connect. He's not saying that at all. Or he's not saying be a doormat either. He's saying you can still hold that person accountable. You can still have a tough conversation, but do it without all the mental noise. Do it without all the story. Do it without all the judgment. Living in this life fully requires connection. I mean, we can be curious and present. Two very ordinary things. Our interactions can be extraordinary. As I mentioned, these are somewhat common sense, but they are not common. And so using them gives you an edge. And so my hope is that you find value in the ordinary, that you teach through your presence, that you have more transformations than transactions, and that you make this one precious life, this one precious moment extraordinary. Thank you.